Hello, folks. Welcome. Thanks for being here. This is our keynote for the Quails cohort of Learning for Action and also just a public event here at Terra.2. It's great to see so many of you here. And as always, if you can turn your cameras on, we'd love it. If you can't, that's okay. We understand. My name is Greg Findley, and I'm the director of Terra.2's 12-week flagship course, Climate Change Learning for Action. And the talk today, as I mentioned, is the keynote for the fellows in our newly launched Quails cohorts. And these fellows come from more than 20 different countries, and they come from a broad range of professional backgrounds. The Learning for Action course, if you're new to Terra.2 and our ecosystem, the Learning for Action course is an intensive exploration of climate science, climate impacts, and climate solutions. It's a combination of written classes and live weekly lab sessions, deep dives, and expert guest talks like this one. And they're all intended to help fellows learn about climate change so they can find their role in working to address it. Everyone here wants to do something about this problem. Terra.2 was founded in 2020. We have an ambitious goal of getting 100 million people working on climate change this decade. We have quite a ways to go to meet that goal, but it's an ambitious goal because it's a huge problem. We offer a new cohort of this course starting approximately every 6 weeks. Our next cohort will start on April 27th, and if you're interested, please check it out. Um, I think you're all on mute. Appreciate that. If you could be muted, that would be fantastic. We do have questions and answers set up for the fellows in the Quails cohort on Slido. And fellows, you should have a link in Slack. You can find that. You can ask your questions there, but others are welcome to ask questions in the chat, and we'll get to those if we get a chance. So I'm incredibly excited to have Melissa Hornbein here to speak with us today. I've known Melissa for some time. I used to live in Montana, and we served on the board of the Montana Sierra Club. Briefly, we overlapped there. It's great to have her with us. She's going to talk about the landmark youth constitutional climate lawsuit in Montana. Held versus Montana was the first constitutional climate change lawsuit to go to trial. It was filed in 2020 with 16 youth plaintiffs from across Montana, and they alleged that the state government had violated their constitutional right to a clean and healthful environment. The ruling was in favor of the plaintiffs, and it was the first legal opinion of its kind, spelling out the environmental harms caused by greenhouse gas emissions, as well as the effects of climate change on the physical and mental well-being of young people. Melissa was one of the other attorneys on the case. She's an attorney with the Western Environmental Law Center, WELC, and she joined that in 2020 after working in state and federal government. She holds a BS in botany and a BA in anthropology from the University of Washington. She obtained her JD in 2008 from Hastings College of Law. The next year, she earned an MS in environmental studies from the University of Montana. Before practicing as an attorney, Melissa worked in the field as a botanist, biological technician for various academic and governmental entities, including the National Park Service and the U.S. Geological Survey. She worked as an attorney with the Montana Department of Natural Resources and Conservation on tribal and federal water rights issues, and as an assistant U.S. attorney in Montana with the Department of Justice. She works from Welk's Rocky Mountain office and is based in Helena, Montana. Melissa, thank you so much for being with us. I'm going to turn it over to you, and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Greg, for that introduction. And thank you so much, all of you, for letting me chat with you this morning. I'm really excited about this program. I think it's amazing, and it is a total privilege to be able to talk to you today. And I love seeing where everyone is here. I really don't like just talking at people, and I know that's what I'm here to do, but I want to at least start out with a little bit of um, dialogue, even if virtual. I want to open up with a couple of questions, and I'm curious if anyone in this group has ever been to Montana. And if you could just like raise your hand in the virtual sense, since not everyone's got their cameras on, that would be fantastic. Okay, I'm seeing a few. Have any of you, okay, you can go ahead and lower your hands. Have any of you heard of the youth climate case held versus state of Montana? Okay, seeing some hands, a number of hands. And I already know that you're all here because you're passionate about addressing the climate crisis. Um, all of those things, having visited Montana, even if you haven't visited Montana, you know of it. Being aware of this case are points of connection between us. And that's really the focus of what I want to talk about today. I'm going to talk about it in the context of this legal case held versus state and the aftermath, really. Um, but we're at an unprecedented inflection point in history, clearly in the US and globally with respect to the climate crisis, and also just the trend that we're seeing in government leadership or lack thereof, both here in the US and around the world. And so, one of the things I've been thinking really hard about, I am a litigator, I'm a lawyer, that's what I do, but we need something more. That litigation is an incredibly powerful tool, as are all of the things that you do, all of your areas of expertise. But the thing that I think connects all of those tools that we have and creates real power to address the crisis that we're facing is the sense of community and connection between people and place. And I'm going to be talking this morning about the connection between people and this very special place that I call home, the state of Montana. But the same sense of connection connects all of us. We all care about these issues. And then you all have these networks of connections within your places where you work. And I think that's where the real power lies, more than in any one court case, in any one law. All of those things are tools that we use to address these problems, but what gives it power is that sense of connectivity. And that's what I'd like to chat with you about this morning. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and talk to you about HELD, but more than that, about what comes next and what we do in the face of the challenges that we're facing, or at least what we're doing in Montana. And would love to hear some thoughts from all of you once the presentation's over about how that translates to where you are in the work you're doing. So these are just a few intro pictures of Montana. It's a beautiful place. For those of you who haven't visited, please come visit us. It's amazing here. And this is really what we're all within my community of connections here in Montana. This is what we're working to protect. I'm going to start with a brief overview of the legal case. I don't want to go into great detail on that because really I want to talk about what it means for the future, both here in Montana and elsewhere, and kind of how we're using the stories that were told as part of this case and taking both those stories and just the practice of storytelling forward to hopefully make change and not just have to be on defense, defending this victory, but actually make it mean something more than just words on paper. In Montana, we are incredibly fortunate to have this extraordinary language in our state constitution. We, the people, grateful to God for the quiet beauty of our state, the grandeur of our mountains, the vastness of our rolling plains, and desiring to improve the quality of life, equality of opportunity, and to secure the blessings of liberty for this and future generations, do ordain and establish this constitution. This is the preamble to our constitution. And the language that I'm going to talk about in the context of HELD comes a bit later in Article 9, Section 2 and Article 3, Section 1, where the Constitution gives the state, the state and each person, the right to a clean and healthful environment. This was the legal basis for HELD versus Montana. And the case itself was really quite simple. It was a challenge to two state laws that we asserted on behalf of the plaintiffs violated that constitutional provision, the right to a clean and healthful environment. One was called the state energy policy, and it was basically a love letter to fossil fuels. It talked about everything that the state would do to promote energy development. And by energy development, they really meant fossil fuel development, coal, oil, and gas. Um, that was one of the laws that we challenged as unconstitutional in this case. Right before this case ended up going to trial, our legislature repealed that state energy policy. And we made an argument to the judge that, they can take away the law, but they don't take away the policy. But unfortunately, that legal claim was not one that we were able to carry forward to trial. The one that was the real heart of this case was much more fundamental, and it was part of a law called the Montana Environmental Policy Act. For those of you who live in the United States, you're probably familiar with the National Environmental Policy Act. MEPA is what is called a mini NEPA. It is sort of the state's version of the National Environmental Policy Act. And those of you who are here probably know that NEPA is what we call a procedural statute. It's an information generating statute, and it basically says it's a look before you leap law. The same thing with MEPA, the Montana Environmental Policy Act. It requires the state to educate both itself, its own agencies and employees, and the citizenry, the people of Montana, before it takes an action that affects the environment. But in Montana, MEPA has a unique role because of that constitutional language I talked about, the right to a clean and healthful environment. And so the core law that we challenged in Held versus State essentially told the state government, you can look at the environmental impacts of what you're going to do in any given action, but you can't look at how those impacts occur outside of the state of Montana. And this law was really created and engineered to prohibit the state from looking at climate change. And in fact, partway through the legislative session before the Held trial, the legislature actually amended the law to explicitly say, state of Montana, in doing environmental analysis before taking an action to develop energy, specifically fossil fuel energy, you cannot look at, disclose, analyze, or relate to the public how that energy development will affect climate change. You can't talk about greenhouse gas emissions. So they made it really explicit. And our argument was, hey, that law clearly violates the right to a clean and healthful environment, which has to include a stable climate. And these were all the specific defendants. The main defendant in the state was the state of Montana. Also sued the governor, the Department of Natural Resources that does oil and gas permitting, the Department of Environmental Quality that gives air quality permits, the Department of Transportation, and then the Public Service Commission, which is our utility regulatory body here in the state. The lawsuit was filed on behalf of these 16 amazing young people. At the time that it was filed in March of 2020, they ranged in age from Jeff, the youngest right here, who was 2 at the time, to Ricky, whose name is on the case, Ricky Held, and she was the only plaintiff who was 18 at the time, which is why her last name appeared as the name of the case. After a number of efforts on the part of the state to get the case thrown out before trial, we had 7 different motions to dismiss. The state tried twice to get the Montana Supreme Court to step in and say, this case shouldn't go to trial, you have to dismiss it. There were 36 depositions, including 12 of the youth plaintiffs, 10 of our expert witnesses, the state's expert witnesses, many of the state's employees. 3 years of litigation, and we finally got to trial in June of 2023. And that felt like such an achievement just to get to the courthouse doors, because there was all this fighting, and the state really devoted all of its litigation efforts to trying to prevent this case from ever making it into a courthouse. And so it felt like this amazing achievement to be part of the first climate case ever to actually go to trial in the US. And this is the first day of trial, all the plaintiffs walking into the courthouse, and it was really this amazing experience where people were lined up down the sidewalk, cheering these young people and supporting them. And it wasn't just the first day, they showed up every day for 8 days. And so every morning when these young people entered the courthouse, it was to this cheering crowd. And it was incredibly moving. And it was also evidence of this amazing connection that people felt with the stories that these youth plaintiffs were telling, with their fears about the future, their fears about climate change. People rode buses from all over the state to stay in Helena for the week of trial and just be there to support these kids. And of course, um, at the root of this case was that constitutional language, the right to a clean and healthful environment. And as our first witness at trial, we had Maynan Ellingson, who was the youngest delegate to our 1972 Constitutional Convention and was responsible for helping to draft that language. And she talked to the court about what motivated the delegates when they drafted that language. And she made it very clear that their first and foremost focus in drafting that language, the right to a clean and healthful environment, was to protect the environment. It wasn't to protect the environment and promote industry. It wasn't to just put words on a page. It was actually to ensure that the environment was protected not only for present, but also for future generations, and to make it clear that the state and each person and the legislature had a responsibility to ensure that that provision actually meant something. The real stars, though, were the youth plaintiffs. This is Olivia, and she's showing one of her paintings and talked about how her fear about climate change and the climate crisis affected her and affected her, motivated her art, motivated her involvement with this case. Um, this is Micah. He's another one of the youth plaintiffs. He was 14 at the time. He's a hardcore long distance runner who lives in Missoula, Montana, and he also has asthma, and he talked about how Montana's increasing length and severity of wildfire seasons were affecting him both as a runner and as a person, and were affecting his asthma. And I'm actually going to let you hear from Micah in his own words here, talking about how he feels as a result of climate change.
Where the testimony about today, truth is no truth, that it doesn't true someone like that. Okay, so we can see.
Hi guys, I'm just finding an image on the screen right now. Could you please describe that photo for me?
That's a picture of me in my backyard, and this is in the summertime, and it's smoky.
And how about the words to the right of the photo? What's that?
That's a poem I wrote.
Can you kind of describe the circumstances around when you wrote this poem?
Yeah, recently the rest of my family had gotten COVID, and so I had to quarantine in a basement for many days, and it was too smoky outside for me to go outside at all, so I was just stuck in a basement for days.
Micah, would you please read your poem for us?
I've been living in quarantine in my basement for a week now, separated from my family because of COVID-19. Cooking, eating, schooling, alone. I have another week to go. I just found out that pandemics are more likely to occur with a changing climate, and now I can't even go outside to play because another fire started near my home. It wasn't the first time, and it won't be the last. According to the experts, the smoke from the forest fires make our air too toxic to breathe, and the fires will only get worse, they say. Yet the climate crisis is only getting started. I'm a prisoner in my own home, alone and wondering, what is my future? Is there one? Why is no one listening? Do they not care?
Micah, there are a lot of people listening to you right now, including the court in the state of Montana. What do you want to say to them?
Well, I hope that people try to make a difference, and I hope that the state of Montana can change their ways and protect the citizens of Montana and me and the fellow plaintiffs.
Wow. I still get choked up every time I hear that, and it's really hard to convey what it felt like to be sitting in that courtroom and hearing Micah's story and every one of the other youth plaintiff stories who testified, and each one in their own unique way was just as compelling as Micah, and it was incredibly powerful. And honestly, that's what this case really was about. It was about telling the plaintiff stories. We had all kinds of evidence about how each of these young people were impacted by climate change, but that wouldn't have meant nearly as much or had nearly as much impact if they didn't demonstrate such skill, bravery, and emotion in explaining that these climate impacts aren't just data points or words on a page, they're happening to real people. And of course, the other star of the trial was climate change itself. If I can get this to go to the next slide. There we go. And so I'm one of thousands of attorneys who have spent their careers fighting to address climate change in the courts. But unbelievably, this is really the first time that climate change and climate science has been on trial, and that there has been a court proceeding that covered that science and sort of the impacts of climate change on individuals really from A to Z. And in part, that was the nature of this trial. That was sort of how we designed our case. But in part, we also have the state of Montana, the defendants in this case, to thank for this unique opportunity to really go in front of a court and in front of a judge and explain exactly how climate change works. And that was because the state would not, we filed a 108-page complaint in this case, really laying out climate change from soup to nuts. And the state didn't concede a single point that we put in our complaint, which then put us in the position of having to do the whole trial from the very beginning. They didn't concede to the basic science of climate change, that increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere causes the climate to heat up. So the way that we did that was through the plaintiff stories, like Micah's story, like Olivia's story, but we paired each plaintiff with an expert witness. And we had this amazing roster of 10 expert witnesses who volunteered hundreds of hours of their time for free to participate in this case and help illustrate and back up the plaintiff stories with these data points. And of course, the first sort of story we told was the story of climate change itself through Dr. Steve Running, a Nobel Prize winning climate scientist who worked on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's initial reports in the early 2000s. And he talked about sort of just the basic facts of how increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere leads to a warming climate through what's called this image on the screen is called the Keeling curve. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. This is data from Mauna Loa going back to before 1960 and just showing the increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And we know that in about 1850, right at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, there were approximately 220 million parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. In 2022, the year before Held went to trial, we were at 420 parts per million. One of the things that Dr. Running talked about in his testimony is that there actually is a standard for a stable climate, a safe climate, and that is 350 parts per billion. Of course, we blew past that level, but Dr. Running talked about how it is absolutely scientifically possible to get back to that level, and that a stable climate system should be part of that guarantee of the Montana Constitution to the right to a clean and healthful environment. Talking about the climate science, we also had Dr. Kathy Whitlock, who is an incredibly accomplished climate scientist from the university or from Montana State University here in Bozeman, and talked about the impacts of climate change on Montana, both currently and into the future. She's written a number of reports on that topic. But it wasn't just climate scientists. We had water scientists as well, glaciologists and hydrologists who talked about what the course of climate change means for Montana. And of course, in Montana, we have this incredible photographic record from Glacier National Park of what started out again in the 1850s as about 150 glaciers across the park. We are now at 26 remaining named glaciers, and we have this amazing photographic record actually going back to the late 1800s, showing these glaciers through the practice of repeat photography and how they have shrunk over the years. And this is the pictures on this slide are Grinnell Glacier, one of the larger glaciers in the park, between the years of 1938, where you can see that it's essentially a solid sheet of ice, taking up the entire picture frame, up until the 2000s, when it is the glacier itself is this piece that's at the top of the cliff and this little tiny remaining piece going into Grinnell Lake. And, you know, even now in 2025, excuse me, that glacier is a lot smaller than it was in 2015. We also had Dr. Jack Stanford talk about how those glaciers are actually what we call water towers. They are incredibly important water storage reservoirs for the state. And as the glaciers shrink, those water resources commensurately shrink as well, with corresponding impacts both to wildlife and to people. We talked about how these changes, we have experts who talked about how these changes translate into the health effects that some of the plaintiffs were feeling. Micah was one of 4 of the youth plaintiffs who had asthma or a related physiological respiratory condition that is exacerbated by increasing wildfire smoke during the summers, increasing heat, and poorer air quality. We also had Dr. Lori Byron, who talked about how children and young people are not just mini adults in terms of how they're impacted by climate change. Because of their physiology, their developing lungs, developing brains, they are more susceptible than adults to the impacts of these types of climatic and environmental changes that climate change causes. And we also had witnesses who talked about the impacts of climate change and the state's policy of ignoring climate change on cultural practices. Sariel is a member of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes on the Flathead Indian Reservation in Northwest Montana, and she talked compellingly, and then Dr. Michael Derglo, who is head of the Tribal Preservation Department on the CSKT reservation, about how climate change is actually impacting the stories that are passed on from generation to generation within Sariel's culture. And those include things like stories that can only be told, stories about the natural environment that can only be told when there's snow on the ground. When there's not snow on the ground in certain winters, those stories can't get passed on to the next generation. And as those elders within the community die, they have the potential to be lost forever. And those practices that are dependent on certain climatic conditions can't be passed on from that generation to Sariel's generation. And then as you can see here, she is harvesting sweetgrass and showing her younger siblings how the harvest is done and how the preservation is done. We also had an expert witness, Ann Hedges, who has worked in the conservation community here in Montana for more than 3 decades and is an expert on the history of state energy policy and the state's practice of doubling down and doubling down and doubling down again on fossil fuel energy, and actually actively suppressing the ability for the state to transition to renewable energy sources. And then finally, we had experts who talked about the impacts of Montana on climate change generally, both at the state and global level. One of the arguments that the state made, both in trying to get the case dismissed and at trial, was like, hey, we are a state of barely more than 1 million people. even if we change our ways dramatically tomorrow, that's not going to have a global impact. And so really there's nothing that we can do as a state to redress the plaintiff's injuries from climate change. And so we had Mr. Peter Erickson, who is a greenhouse gas accounting expert, and he testified that Montana's greenhouse gas emissions, because of the fossil fuel resources within the state and the state's practice of developing those fossil fuel resources, result in CO2 emissions that are equivalent to entire countries such as Argentina, the Netherlands, and Pakistan that have exponentially more millions of people than we have here. And then, as a corollary to Pete Erickson's testimony, we had Dr. Mark Jacobson, who is one of the world's leading experts in renewable energy transitions, talk about how we have the technology, not in the future, but right now, to transition Montana entirely from a fossil fuel energy-based economy to a renewable-based energy economy, and that would actually save the state billions of dollars per year over the next 30 years. And I want to give you one more little snippet here. This is Pete Erickson talking about greenhouse gas accounting, which I think has the potential to be one of the more boring topics maybe in the world. But this little clip just illustrates the extent to which not only the plaintiffs, but the experts were these incredibly compelling storytellers, and how that influenced both the judge and, of course, the people watching around the world, just to have the ability to make these types of, potentially very dry and technical discussions really relatable to people.
Do you have an opinion as to whether Montana can offset any reduction in greenhouse gas emissions against its ongoing contribution to climate change?
So first, let me just say, if Montana is making efforts to increase renewable energy, that's great. Like, there's no that they should be rewarded or praised in some way for that. However, this statement, I need to take Mr. Anderson's use of the word offset on face value here, because offset means something in greenhouse gas accounting, which is my area of expertise, right? An offset is something that you buy or commission in a marketplace to credit against your own emissions. There are ways of doing that legitimately. What he's describing is absolutely not one of them, right? He's saying that, again, if taking the words literally, that Montana should get to credit reductions relative to some imagined emissions that it didn't emit against its own actual emissions. Now, I'm sorry, but I have to try to use a metaphor here because it's so preposterous. I like cake, but a lot of people here like cake. Imagine I have a piece of cake and I eat that piece of cake. It's delicious. And imagine, you really want another piece of cake? There's another piece of cake sitting in the kitchen. I don't eat that piece of cake. What was my cake consumption today? 0. 1 piece of cake plus a negative 1 piece of cake. 0 cake. That's great. So that is, you can't offset your own emissions against something you didn't do. If you didn't do that thing, that's enough credit in its own, because that should have reduced your actual emissions or cake.
So that was Dr. Erickson talking about in response to testimony from the state's economic expert. And I think it gives a great example both of, how you can make climate science relatable to a lay audience, and also how these completely bogus arguments that the state was making about climate science and the economics of climate change can really be effectively undercut in a way that you don't have to be a greenhouse gas accounting expert to understand. After the trial, which concluded in June of 2023, A couple of months later, on August 14th, we got this amazing 103-page decision from Judge Kathy Seeley, who is the district court judge who heard the case. And it was really remarkable, not even so much in the fact of its kind of core holding, which was that Montana's constitutional right to a clean and healthful environment also includes the right to a stable climate system. It was remarkable for the fact that it was this incredible record of all of this trial testimony, both of the plaintiffs and of all of our experts. So it has become a resource, not just within the state of Montana, where of course it's legal precedent, but for others who are working on climate related issues around the country and even beyond, look, here is what a court found about climate science, and it's legitimate. Not only is it legitimate in scientific communities, but it has been reduced to a judicial opinion. And so, of course, the state immediately appealed that decision. And a year later, basically in July, we had oral argument in front of the Montana Supreme Court. And then in December of 2024, just before Christmas, we got this amazing gift from the Montana Supreme Court, which was not just a straight affirmance of Judge Seeley's opinion. That's what we were hoping for. We just wanted the court to uphold her opinion and to have it be citable law within Montana. But the court went farther. And I'm just going to read this brief passage from the Montana Supreme Court's order on the held case, talking about really what the right to a clean and healthful environment means for the state of Montana. We reject the argument that the delegates, intending the strongest all-encompassing environmental protections in the nation, and that goes back to the testimony of Maynann Ellingson at trial, both anticipatory and preventative for present and future generations, would grant the state a free pass to pollute the Montana environment just because of the rest of the world insisted on doing so. Montana's right to a clean and healthful environment and environmental life support system includes a stable climate system, which is clearly within the object and true principles of the framers' inclusion of the right to a clean and healthful environment. Wow, that is amazing language to have in any court opinion, and especially one from the highest court of the state. Of course, there was an immediate backlash. These are statements from the Montana legislature and various leadership within the state of Montana. And again, I'm just going to let you hear briefly from them in their own words.
The Held versus State of Montana decision didn't just make headlines. It sent shockwaves through Montana's economy. This wasn't a simple court ruling. It was an open invitation for activists to weaponize our environmental laws against the very industries that keep Montana running and Montanans employed.
Thank you. The Held decision was a gift-wrapped present to radical environment activists, an open door for endless lawsuits designed to shut down Montana's fossil fuel industry. It had nothing to do with protecting the environment and everything to do with weaponizing the courts to strangle our economy.
Good afternoon. I'm Sonia Nowakowski, and I serve as the director of the Montana Department of Environmental Quality. And I am so thankful today to our elected officials for inviting me to join them. I stand here very proud of the great work that the House and Senate are both doing with the Montana Environmental Policy Act, or MEPA, and the package of bills that is now moving through the legislature.
So I think you can see what we're up against. When the head of our own Department of Environmental Quality shows up with Republican leadership for a press conference to applaud their efforts, and it wasn't stated here explicit, well, it was stated pretty explicitly, to undercut this held decision, it's pretty stunning. And we have to operate in this environment now. We have this amazing Montana Supreme Court decision, but we also have this legislature and state leadership at the agency level who are doing everything they can to fight against this case. And so where do we go from there? As I mentioned previously, I'm a litigator. We use litigation as our primary tool in the work we do to address climate change. And these are some of the things that we're working on right now within the state and hoping to leverage the held decision to get to actually make progress on some of these issues of, idle and abandoned oil and gas wells that are leaking methane into the atmosphere, addressing refinery pollution, fighting efforts on the part of the legislature every single session to weaken water quality, trying to protect water quantity in the face of a changing climate. All of these things are made exponentially harder by the leadership that we have in our state right now. And of course, that is very much reflected at the national level with what's happening in our country's government. And so, what do we do? Litigation, like I said, is an important and powerful tool, but it's not the only tool. And one of the lessons that we learned from held versus state is that it is, again, the community, the connections, and the individual stories around climate change which have the power to move the needle, not only by changing decision makers' minds, because that is a long and slow process, certainly here in Montana as well as across the country, but also through creating community, empowering community through those connections between people, and really just helping people feel like they're not alone. That has power on its own account, but it also does ultimately have the power to go into the public record and to make changes and to make leadership take notice. And one of the projects that we started working on almost immediately after the held case finished, or after we got the district court's decision in held, even before the appeal, was working on a rulemaking petition that would require our Public Service Commission, that's responsible for permitting energy within the state, to consider climate change. And I know that sounds pretty basic, but that's kind of where we are in Montana. And just achieving that would be really a huge achievement within the state. This is something that we're continuing to work on, but we submitted this petition on behalf of 40 different petitioners, from individuals to environmental organizations to industry. We had ski area operations managers who came and testified in favor of this petition. And it's just one more example of how harnessing the power of individual stories has the ability to forge connections within community and to impact leadership. And this is my last little clip here of just more stories about climate and how the power behind those stories can help forge these connections and increase the impact of things like individual cases or litigation.
Thank you, Commissioners. My name is Aaron Scher from Livingston, Montana. I'm here with August Scher and Jasper Scher, my sons. This is a time when we need to incentivize solar energy, all clean energy, public and private, not penalize it. Solar panels aren't the only reason I came here today. I have another investment, a much bigger investment, standing right behind me. And you better protect it, so help me God. August and Jasper inspire me to come here today. I'm putting solar panels on my roof, not only to invest in my future, but in their future. I'm assuming you have kids and grandkids. Your responsibility is to protect their future, and you must consider climate in your calculations.
I'm a senior in high school at Bozeman High, and at this time of day, I'm typically in my government class. So instead of being at school today, I'm here to speak for all the high schoolers and youth who are worried. Before I lived in Bozeman, I lived in Billings up until 2022, and in Billings, my childhood was filled with contaminated water, polluted air, and torn up lands. I didn't realize that my childhood was polluted and my health was at risk because of the effects of climate change until I left Billings. Northwestern Energy has made my and many other kids' childhoods tainted with the effects of their energy extractions. I know I'm not the only high schooler to feel this way. So many, if not all, are terrified of the very scary reality that I, the person speaking to you right now, will not have a habitable planet to live on when I'm older. If you have children, grandchildren, or any mercy for the youth of Montana, I urge you to consider the climate costs in the development of Northwestern Energy. I stand here today channeling the power, anger, and fear of thousands of young Montanans who deserve better. I believe I deserve better than to be disproportionately affected by Northwestern Energy's export as a low-income Montanan. I believe other low-income and minority Montanans deserve to live not by coal mines and fuming factories, but in thriving communities. This beautiful state deserves better than to be ripped apart for coal and energy so a few people can make a profit. This rule is not radical, it's not political, it is a right that we have in Montana's constitution. And as elected officials, please listen to the people of which you are affecting the most. Adopt the rule and give us a livable future. Thank you.
Thank you, commissioners.
So that's it. I think that for me, held versus state is not a be all and end all. Obviously, it's not the silver bullet that's going to solve how the state deals with climate change in Montana, or anywhere else. But what it is an incredibly compelling demonstration of how the power of telling individual stories, connecting people, can bring them together. And this is a picture of the Climate Action Day at our state legislature back just in January of this year. And then the picture on the right is Eva, one of the youth plaintiffs from HELD, two of the attorneys, Roger Sullivan and Barbara Chilcott, who is my colleague at WELC. And then on the right is Dr. Steve Running, our Nobel Prize winning climate expert from the HELD case. And I think, bottom line, as an attorney, we have a tendency to get siloed and, work in our own little domains of litigation and sort of forget that there is a bigger community out there. And things like this Climate Action Day, like held versus state, like our efforts before the Montana Public Service Commission, remind not only leadership, but also, me doing this work and everyone else who's trying to do this work, that we are part of something much bigger. And the lesson that I have taken from this case and will take going forward and try to incorporate into every case that I file going forward is that there is a human element. There are stories behind these cases. It's not just about data points, and it's those stories that really move people and actually make a difference. So with that, thank you so much for being here. I would love to hear any reflections you have on sort of how this relates to the work you do, and would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so very, very much, Melissa. That was fantastic and great story. We have a little bit of time for questions, and there's nothing in Slido at the moment, so please feel free to just raise your hand and we can take some questions that way. The first question, though, Melissa, was from Carrie, and it was, how did the plaintiffs get in contact with you and our Children's Trust, especially when you have 2-year-olds and others who are some of the plaintiffs?
Yeah, so that we faced allegations from sources like Fox News saying that we were basically taking advantage of these children and using their stories to drive our crazy green agenda. And that's really not what happened. Jeff and Nate, who were the two youngest plaintiffs, are actually the sons of a former colleague of mine at WELC, Laura King, and she wanted her kids to be involved. But with the exception of Jeff and Nate, essentially every one of the other youth plaintiffs made the decision on their own account to get involved. Many of these, I don't even want to call them kids, they're just amazing young people, were involved in climate activism within their communities and schools. And there was actually an effort in 2011 to bring this claim in what's called an original action straight to the Montana Supreme Court. That wasn't successful. The Supreme Court told us we had to go back and, start at the beginning in the trial court. And that's what gave rise to the idea for this case. And then the attorneys who were working on it in Montana, it was really just word of mouth. And plaintiffs heard about the fact that the case was being put together and wanted to be involved.
Thanks. This was the first of these cases, constitutional case, to go to court. There was a national case, I believe, Juliana. I believe that has been shut down. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Maybe, do you know much about that one?
Yeah, so Juliana, and I guess this is a great time to acknowledge our partners in this litigation, our Children's Trust. They specialize in this type of youth constitutional climate litigation, and they brought the case Juliana, which has been subject of lots of coverage, most specifically the great Netflix documentary, Youth v. Gov. And if you haven't seen that, I highly recommend you watch it. The Juliana case was really kind of a parallel to the held case in terms of the types of claims that were being made, but but the case was brought under the federal constitution against the federal government. And as we all know, or many of us know, and probably now you all know, our federal constitution does not have a similar right to a clean and healthful environment that the Montana Constitution and those of several other states have. And while the Ninth Circuit found the story behind Juliana incredibly compelling, they felt that what the Juliana plaintiffs were asking for, which was basically for the court to force the government to develop a plan to address climate change, was a violation of the separation of powers under our Constitution and was what we call a non-justiciable political question.
All right, thank you. We've had a few questions about plaintiff stories being shared on social, and could others help to do that? Charlie asked specifically two things. One, how is this all financed, and have their testimonial stories been filmed, and are they available for public viewing? And if some of them put things on social media, and could they be amplified somehow? Could we help?
Yeah, so Greg, I'll send you the contact at Our Children's Trust after this, and you're welcome to share it. In terms of contact with individual plaintiffs, everything goes through OCT. Their individual stories in the form of their trial testimony is all online. The entire trial is online. It's this incredible video resource. It's free for anyone to use and download and view. And that is all on Our Children's Trust webpage for this case, Held versus State of Montana. I can send you that link as well. And it's broken up really nicely by witness, so you can watch any individual plaintiff's testimony at trial. And they've also engaged in extensive media events and coverage, both individually and collectively. So they have been out there front and center, and most of them are really amenable to requests to amplify their stories further, because like all of you, they're really passionate about this. In terms of financing, it was a combination. My organization takes in about a third of our operating budget in the form of grants, about a third in individual donations, and then a third in attorney fee recovery. So when we win a case, we can recover fees. And that's actually at the stage that we're at right now in the Held case. Is we are litigating with the state over our entitlement to and the appropriate amount of attorney's fees for that case. Our Children's Trust does less active litigation than we do, so they don't have that sort of attorney fee recovery as part of their basic operating budget. And it was a lot of individual donations. So people made this possible. As I mentioned, all 10 of our amazing expert witnesses donated all of their time, hundreds of hours to this case. So it was really like a grassroots community effort funded by individual donations as well as grants.
Yeah, thank you. There was a question from Barath. Could this be appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court? And given the composition, is there risk that it would be overturned?
Yeah, I think, I guess there's a very slight chance that, well, certainly anyone can appeal anything to the U.S. Supreme Court. The docket, their docket is very small. They only take a very limited number of cases per year. I'm like, 5 years ago, I would have said absolutely not, no way. But things have gotten so crazy, I won't say that anymore. It is very unlikely that the U.S. Supreme Court would accept certiorari of this case, because it involves a question of a state constitution. And under the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, states have the ability to develop their own laws as long as they don't infringe on the federal constitution. And those laws can be, and including in state constitutions, can be more stringent than the federal constitution, as Montana's constitution is. So there is not a good case to be made for a petition to the U.S. Supreme Court, and there's an even smaller likelihood that such a case would be accepted for review.
Have you seen places, Melissa, where this case, other states are looking at this case, and youth or others in other states are thinking of filing similar cases?
Yeah, so there are about six others. Well, there are six states that share what's called a green amendment. So similar language to Montana's constitutional provision that gives the right to a clean and healthful environment. Some of those in many of those cases, our Children's Trust has brought cases. Some of those cases have been defeated on sort of procedural grounds. Very few of those states that have such constitutional provisions are quite as explicit as Montana's. But most recently in the state of Hawaii, our Children's Trust negotiated and entered into a really amazing settlement agreement with the state. They had sued the state. The case was about to go to trial, and the state ultimately settled and agreed to basically a climate action plan to get the state of Hawaii completely off of fossil fuels, I believe, by 2035. And that was really a landmark decision, and it happened almost exactly a year after Held went to trial. And I think that the Hawaii court system and the government defendants in Hawaii were absolutely clearly aware of this case and the precedent that it set, and they didn't want to put it to the test before the Hawaii judicial system. I do want to add just one thing. A green amendment, there are a lot of efforts in other states to get green amendments to their constitution. I think those are fantastic, but as we've seen in Montana, it's not a silver bullet. It's like one piece of the puzzle. Absolutely, people should be working on those things, but there are many other areas where the language from Held can be taken forward, even in the absence of a constitutional provision like the one we have, to make those same arguments.
Thanks. I have a question. So the Held ruling was favorable. What does that mean for the state? What actions are the state? What's changing within the state? Seems the Public Service Commission is still ruling in favor or accepting Northwestern Energy's plans for new gas plants instead of renewables. So are things changing, or is it just out there and no real impact?
They are changing, but unfortunately, it's going to require more litigation to get them to comply. And there are a couple of different reasons for that. Of course, the main one is that we have this absolutely insane state leadership that will do anything they can to fight this decision. Nonetheless, that decision is law within the state of Montana. However, the claim that we went to trial on, if you'll recollect, under the Montana Environmental Policy Act, that act does not apply to the Montana Public Service Commission, which is why we submitted the rulemaking petition that I showed you the video of towards the end of the presentation. My personal feeling is that based on the makeup of our Public Service Commission, which is very similar to our legislative makeup, we're going to have to sue them to make the very basic case that the constitutional provision doesn't apply only in the context of MEPA, it applies to the state and all of its agencies. So that's kind of one of the first next steps that we're going to be taking after Held to ensure that this decision actually means something on the ground. As of right now, our Department of Environmental Quality has admitted that climate change is happening. I know that sounds crazy, but that's a big achievement, and that they have to analyze the impacts of climate change in decisions they make about fossil fuel energy decisions. Of course, it's going to require, again, more litigation to make sure that that analysis is actually complete.
Thanks. Well, yeah, it's been an hour. Thank you so much, Melissa, for your time. Thank you, fellows, for attending. As you're going to learn as we go through the program, this is one of the many different ways that we can address the climate crisis and try to lead on climate action. So thank you so much, Melissa, for playing your part in that. And everyone, we're going to get into climate communications and economics and politics soon in the course. And we do have a few other questions, but I think we're at an hour. I want to make sure we respect your time and everyone's time. So thank you. And Melissa, if you want to stick around, we can ask a few more questions.
I'm happy to stick around if anyone else is interested. Yeah, sorry, my presentation was a little longer than it always
fantastic. Is. Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay, thanks all. And so, yeah, Melissa, Tak had asked a question. We kind of got to it, but what do you think the impact of the more emboldened and anti-climate new Trump administration in cases like Held versus state of Montana? What might be the best ways for us individuals to help support them?
Yeah, so I've been thinking about this a lot because in some ways, as shocking as this administration is, and it's intended to be shocking, I think that's part of the agenda, is to sort of just overwhelm us with the insanity of action and the volume of action so that we're immobilized. In some ways, we've been facing this in Montana for about the last 5 years in terms of our state level leadership and our legislature. And this is where I think that breaking down traditional silos between advocacy groups is going to be really critically important. And, as I mentioned before, as attorneys, we tend to like hunch down in front of our computers and write our briefs and not worry about what's happening in the rest of the world. And I think that type of like single focus isn't really sustainable in the world that we live in now. And so one of the things that we're doing within Montana is we're trying to actively reach out to groups who have not been interested in litigation in the past, who we have not typically worked with in the past, community-based groups, low-income energy groups, people who are impacted by climate change, but maybe climate change isn't the one and only thing that they work on at a policy or at a legal level. And I think the value of forging those kinds of connections is not only that it gives you those sort of stories to tell, like Carly, the high school student who testified before the Montana Public Service Commission, but it also creates sort of a brain trust. Like as a litigator, I have a very narrow skill set for what I know how to do. I can write legal briefs and I can file things before the court. But many of our partner groups, they don't litigate and they don't have those skills, but they have advocacy and grassroots organizing skills that I wouldn't know how to begin with. And so starting those conversations between really disparate climate action groups and also social action groups, because climate change is not just an environmental issue, it's a social justice issue. Forging those connections and figuring out new ways to use everyone's expertise. One of the things we're talking about right now with the community climate group in Missoula is how to publicize when there are comment opportunities on fossil fuel infrastructure. Most of the time, it's us commenting on behalf of one or two clients, and those are the only comments that go in against these projects because people just don't know how to access that information. And so what we're trying to do is connect with a broader range of groups, individuals, and activists to get that information out there and give them the tools they need to engage in that public process.
Yasmin called out in the chat about the Swiss women who won a landmark case there. Do you know much about that one?
Yeah, the Klimas and Yorinen case, I never know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is amazing. It's sort of a corollary to Held in terms of the testimony that these women give. It was senior Swiss women. It started out in the Netherlands and then went to the International Court of Human Rights. And really similar to Held, they told their stories about how they're being impacted by climate change, how they're disproportionately impacted. And Klimas and Yorinen is not the only case from the EU and around the world. Recently, there have been kind of a spate of these amazing climate decisions, really, from international courts, well, international to us in the US, both in the EU and in various island nations, talking about how sort of that core issue of how climate change is not just an environmental problem, it's a human rights problem, and how just core basic human rights give people the right to the benefits of a stable climate system, not necessarily in that language, but along those same lines. And I think that that's what's going to get us beyond Held and beyond these very specific states or nations that have something like the right to a clean and healthful environment, and is tying those environmental impacts from the climate crisis back to core human rights, which almost every national constitution protects in some form or another.
And Melissa, you talked about connecting various organizations, and Emily asked, is there a forum or systems for connecting these organizations? Is there a certain software or a platform or something?
I'm sure there is. I'm not aware of anything specific that is sort of at the national or global level. I think that what the really important thing to think about here is how we can work locally within our own communities to forge these connections. And this is particularly critical right now when we're facing such unprecedented headwinds at the national level. I think that the result is we have to double down on state and local action. This has always been true, but it's even more true now. And so to the extent that we can start forging these connections and having these conversations, even within our own communities, I think that's really where it's at. 2 weeks ago, I and a couple of my colleagues traveled to Missoula, which is a town that's about 2 hours away from us in Montana, because my organization was sponsoring a film at a film festival, at an environmental film festival. We had a little gathering that night of people who came before the film, went with us to watch the film, and then the next day we set up meetings with as many of the organizations based in Missoula that we knew of who were in any way interested in climate, energy costs, human rights, to talk about ways that we could work together in the future. And that actually included a meeting with a city official in Missoula who's working on the city's climate action plan. So I think it's honestly, it feels daunting, but it's at the level of those individual conversations and connections, which then create more connections and more connections, that we need to be starting this movement.
Great. Hey, Charlie, you had a question. Do you mind if I just ask you to ask it out loud?
Of course, yeah. Can you hear me all right? There's something that keeps rocking up in my sort of head, and this is a good opportunity to mention it. And I'll read my question verbatim here. What do you feel stops those opposing, as in the ones that you put up, the people saying that they disagreed, to not actually understanding this as a core problem at a base level? Is it a fear of loss of work? Is it a sense of their identity? Because at the end of the day, you used a word, right? You used the word humans. We are all humans at the end of the day, and we're all in this together. It's this thing that keeps coming back, and it's something I can't reconcile. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, so I mean, this is the billion-dollar question, right? Because we're asking this clearly at a national level. Other folks are asking it in respect to changes they've seen in their national, state, and local governments. It's really puzzling to sort of, at a basic level, it's kind of confounding to understand the climate science, which like at its core is not that complicated. Understand that there is a scientific consensus as to, hey, this is happening. And now we're not just at the state of, hey, this is happening and this is what's going to happen in the future. We're actually, that future is now. We're seeing those effects. I am looking out my window right now at a hillside where 2 summers ago, there was a fire within a quarter mile of my house that I could see from my windows. So people are living these impacts, and yet there is still this cohort, which during the last election in the United States was more than half of the people who voted, that either doesn't believe it or doesn't feel like it's the most important thing. And the only conclusion that I've been able to come to is that the other side, and this is the side that has promoted fossil fuel interests for decades, and has put politicians in power to promote those interests and has engaged in storytelling, has done such a good job of linking fossil fuel-based energy systems and economies to economic health, that is what people believe. And that is one of the core beliefs that we are needing to deconstruct now. At the film festival I attended a couple of weeks ago, we watched a film called The White House Effect, which was really based on all footage from the Carter, Reagan, and Bush 1 administrations. And this is something I didn't know. I was a baby at the time. But Bush 1 actually, the first Bush won on fixing climate change. Like that was the platform he ran on. And that's what this movie was about. And the whole movie was about how the fossil fuel industry came in and managed to influence his administration in such a way that by the end of his administration, they had done a 180 on climate change and started undercutting climate science. And I really think that then, at least in the US, the narrative changed over that 4-year period. And that was over the time when the Kyoto Protocol was established and during the first Paris Climate Accord. And the US's role changed 180 degrees from what it initially would have been in those two global conversations. And so at a national level, I sort of feel like we've never recovered from that initiation of a false narrative on the part of fossil fuel interests, which has now permeated to every level of government and the American people. And that's what we're up against.
Well, and extrapolated out to the entire world,
Yeah, unfortunately.
unfortunately. Okay, thank you. Thanks for your input. It's a tricky topic, very much so.
Yeah, and I don't know that there's one answer, but boy, I spend a lot of time thinking about it as well, and I'm sure everyone on this who's part of this conversation does the same.
Yeah, and I'll just urge you all to keep that question in your mind as you go through this course and think about solutions and how we're going to lead to effective change. Manjari.
Yeah, I have a question right now. There is, of course, the government is going in a different direction, but there's a little bit movement coming at the consumer level, but I will say it's not enough where like we had a boycott one day, right? Like you don't buy anything, no buy day just a couple of weeks ago. Like, is there a way to synergize, like push our government, like put pressure on our government through like a grassroots movements that they need to acknowledge this, otherwise they lose their votes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question and comment. And similarly, and I think it was February 18th was like the Buy Nothing Day.
Yeah.
And those efforts are clearly based on a recognition that if we all engage in that activity or that lack of activity, there will be a huge global impact on the economy. And so, of course, what you're getting at is like, how do we get enough people to do that to actually have that effect? And clearly, I don't know the answer to that. And like I said, I'm a lawyer, so I'm not really good at this human connection stuff. But what I have realized as a result of HELD is that it is those connections, those individual person-to-person connections, which are absolutely critical to get us to that point. And I think that's where I keep going back to the only thing that I know to do, and that is really within my power as an individual to do, is to start having those conversations at the local level, the state level, the national level. And I know that like trickle up is not the most satisfying answer because clearly we need action right now. But it is the one thing I keep coming back to that every single one of us on this Zoom right now has the ability to do. And if we're having those conversations every day and we're spreading them to the next person and the next person and the next person, I think that's how you get that grassroots impact through those types of, single event activism as well as more sustained campaigns. But I'd love to hear what other people think as well.
Thanks. Are there other questions for Melissa? There's some good resources being shared in the chat, different groups. We had Dr. Catherine Hayhoe give a keynote a while back, and she talked about the most important thing you can do about climate change is talk about it. And she talked about how to talk about it. And we can share the link, or your instructor can share the link to that talk as well.
Great. And I will share the resources that I mentioned to you with you, Greg, and you can disseminate them from there. I just want to say thank you all again so much for the opportunity to talk with you this morning. I love what this organization is doing and am inspired by the work that you're all doing. And I think, one thing right now, things are really hard right now. I'm not going to lie. It's hard to be a human in the world, and it's certainly hard to be an American right now. And being part of communities like this, even just tangentially, give me a lot of hope and renewed energy to keep fighting the fight. So thank you for that.
Yeah. echo that 100%. Thank you so much, Melissa. Would you mind also sharing your slides with me? I could share those with the
Yeah,
fellows. They could
absolutely.
watch the recordings and other things.
Yep.
Yeah. Thanks all. This has been great. Melissa, thank you so very much. Great to see
Everyone.
you again.
Likewise.
Thanks all.
Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you.